was talking with some of the guys here over lunch, and I realized that I was a little bit slack on some of my conversation about acoustics and the acoustics of the room in which you're working in, and how to get the most out of that. So I just want to touch on that briefly before moving on. So we talked a lot about the room mic techniques that I have, where I diffuse the microphones that I'm using in my live room. So my live room is about, I think it's about 15 feet by about 25 or 30 feet. So it's a medium size, at least in studio terms, it's a medium sized live room, and it has these clouds in the ceiling, which are made of Owens Corning 703, which is it's basically like, imagine if you could take like a 2-foot thick piece of that pink insulation for your house and compress it down to a stiff board of about 2 inches. And that stuff's useful for broadband trapping. You'll see in a lot of studios, they'll have this like foam stuff on the walls, and I would discourage you from using that in your own studio or your own mixed room. Foam is great for absorbing mid-range and higher frequency sounds like the sound of a human voice. Cool for that stuff. But as soon as you have anything with any low-end content, the foam stuff is pretty useless. So you end up with if a foam is your only acoustical treatment, then you end up having a room that's muffled in the high frequencies but still resonant in the low frequencies, and you end up with a pretty unbalanced frequency response in your room. So what I have in my room above the drum set is the 703 stuff. Actually, it might be 705. I kind of forget the model numbers, but that stuff's above the drum set and floating on the ceiling in the whole live room. And it's sort of hanging down about 1 foot from the ceiling, so sound can bounce around behind it. It's not just flush with the ceiling. There's some air gaps around it, so sound can get behind it, and it absorbs on both sides. And that helps control bass frequencies from bouncing around too much within the room. I also have some diffusers, which is sort of designed to stagger when reflections come back at you. It takes, rather than, I'm sure at some point you've like spoken or played a drum sort of right in front of a big flat wall, and you can hear a distinct echo of that drum coming back at you. If you have a diffuser, like the slats that you see in the photos of my studio, or like this QRD diffuser behind me on this wall, then it sort of staggers when those delays are, and you start to perceive the delay more as reverb and less as a specific delay. A lot of very short delays, which happen in the sized rooms that we're used to working in, you actually don't hear those as delay. You hear them as comb filtering. So let's go back for a second to our earlier conversation about phase. So the way that you hear very short discrepancies in phase is actually not as a delay, but as an EQ. So if you're in a room that has all these kind of short reflections, you're actually hearing a sort of a change in the EQ of the room. You're not perceiving it as a delay. So by diffusing those reflections, you sort of neutralize some of the uneven frequency response curves of your room. So great sounding rooms typically have some sort of mix of absorption and diffusion. My studio was designed by a guy named Wes Lachaux, and he's great at what he does. There's certainly other people out there, and there's a lot of DIY information out there as well too. And I implore you to put a little bit of work into the sound of your recording space before you start recording in there, because it'll dramatically improve the tones of your recordings, and then try to choose techniques appropriate for your recording space. Like the kitchen at Creative Live is this big room with all brick walls and tall ceilings, and that like diffused room mic technique that I talked about earlier, probably wouldn't use that if I happened to be recording drums in that kitchen. I'd probably be doing the opposite. I'd be finding ways to tighten up the sound around the drums, and I'd probably find some kind of baffle or some sort of walls, or maybe it's some unused guitar cabinets, or do something to kind of close in the space around the drum set. So think about the room in which you're recording in as an extension of the instrument that you're recording, and try to make the tone of the instrument sound correct in the room before you even start to mic it. And the same is true for your control room. This whole thing is a cumulative result of many small decisions that you're making, and the better sounding your control room is and your speakers are, the better able you are to make good decisions. So, very small control rooms with low ceilings or, a lot of hard reflective surfaces can be difficult to properly judge the sound coming out of the speakers. I was at a friend's studio recently, and he has quite a small control room, and his left speaker is like here, and then his rack is right there. And I was noticing that everything on the left side sounded really weird. We got a piece of absorptive material and put it in front of the rack and realized that all of a sudden it sounded way better, just because of the reflections coming off the gear were really affecting how he was hearing stuff off the left. Another frequent problem is for, if you have a smaller room without any kind of absorption or diffusion, so again, left speaker, say you've got a hard surface just to your left. Each time sound reflects off a hard surface, it loses about 6 decibels, which is significant but not insignificant. So the sound you're getting, the left speaker might take, 2 feet or 3 feet or something like that to get to your left ear, but then there's also some sound from that speaker bouncing off that wall that is maybe coming back to your ear and after a combined length of 6 feet or 8 feet. And that's such a short time delay that you hear that as comb filtering. And it's an EQ imbalance, so you're not getting a real true representation of what's coming off the speakers. You can try putting some absorption material sort of at ear level on the walls on either side of you. There's a guy I know fairly well in the Boston area where I'm from called Michael Blackmer, who's an acoustician. A lot of his rooms, and this is pretty easy to build yourself if you have a little bit of skill as a carpenter, his rooms, he doesn't do a lot of absorptive treatments in the walls beside him. He'll build these sort of ramps that take the signal. I think he usually does about 15 degrees. So the signal will bounce off the left wall and then hit this 15-degree ramp and be reflected into the ceiling. And then he has a bunch of absorptive materials in the ceiling. So for the reflected sound of that left speaker to come back to your ear, it has to bounce around the room a few times and hit some absorptive stuff and get diffused. So by the time it gets back to you, the reflections are no longer have a direct relation to the speaker sound. So if you have a control room that's built well that has, or even if it's just in your bedroom, you can even set up some mobile little panels that can just help tighten up the sound of your room. You'll be able to make better decisions and ultimately do better engineering. So that's pretty much what I had to say about acoustics. And are there any questions before we move on to talking about drum tracking?
Let's see about that. What do you think,
Or if you guys here have any questions?
Anyone in the room?
Yeah.
So this is going back to drum setup.
Okay.
I was curious about your workflow as far as it seemed like you were setting up overheads first and not even being concerned with anything else and getting those right and then moving on. How do you do that with your workflow?
Well, workflow for me is, that was a little bit of a special case for this class because I knew that I chose those mics. I do sometimes use them on overheads, but I chose those mics primarily because of the switchable polar patterns, and I knew that I wanted to demonstrate a few different positions and polar patterns. And I knew that I could use those mics for overheads and for room. So I basically just plugged them into a mic preamp once, set some gain, and then moved them around and adjusted the pattern. So that's why I started with overheads in this particular case. Typically, I'll get the drum set up, get the drummer comfortable, and then mic the entire kit with what my best first guess is as to what I think will work for them. And of course, I'll go back and change microphones and move positions as needed. But however, as I'm getting tones, I'm not the kind of guy who does the typical front of house engineer thing where it's bass drum first, then snare, then rack toms. I usually start with the ambient mics. So I get the broad brush picture of the kit first. Usually the first thing that I listen to is the overheads and then the room mics. And then I start to bring in all the close mics. And I usually start by having the drummer just sort of run through the record, play the songs that you're going to be playing at the intensity that you're going to be playing them, so I get a realistic impression of how they're going to be playing on the record. And then I'll start by getting everything on and kind of happening, and then once I'm at that point, then I kind of go back and start saying like, all right, let me hear the kick and soloed, and then start checking phase and, or excuse me, I'll check for polarity between the various mics sort of at the end of the process, and then I'll have them run through the whole kit again and make sure everything's working with each other and sort of fine tune it.
Great. Got a question from Kid Pyramid. So when you use the figure 8 polar pattern on a spaced pair, how do you negate phase issues from reverb from the ceiling?
In the case of my studio, like I was just describing in the acoustics segment, that I have a cloud above the drum set. So that's doing broadband absorption of everything from low frequencies up through high frequencies. So I don't have a ton of those reflections. But yeah, it is an issue in certain rooms. If you have more of like a reflective ceiling, you have to be really careful about that. Especially if you're recording, like if you're doing like a basement recording or something like that. Anywhere where there's low ceilings, you've got to be really careful about that figure 8 pattern, and you'll probably be going with cardioid. And the same thing holds true with omnidirectional microphones.
Right. One more maybe from Fretlord. Just wondering if there's a better quality of sound when a drummer tracks at louder volumes. In other words, is louder better?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, yeah. Well, also it depends on the tone of the song and the record. I mean, most of the stuff that I record, I would say medium hard is the best, and that depends on the drummer, their sticks. Heavy sticks sound different than light sticks, and nylon tips sound different than wood tips, and different heads happen. I feel like a drum itself has a natural compression, or maybe it's a result of the drumming and the drum head. That there's like a sort of a minimum intensity need to get a tone out of the drum, and then there's also a maximum intensity where you're hitting it harder and harder, but it's not getting louder, it's just getting more dead. And so a great drummer knows how to play within that window for their drum set and the heads that they're using and their playing style. And if they're on an unfamiliar kit, they have enough feedback coming off the drum set that they can compensate for and hit lighter or harder. The titanium snare drum of mine that I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why I really like that drum is it seems to have a wider dynamic range than a lot of other drums I've recorded. You can hit it really quietly and still get tone out of it, and then you just keep hitting it harder and harder, and it responds to you and grows with you as you grow in volume. And then cymbals, medium, is what I like for cymbal volume. So the greatest drummers for me hit very consistently in volume, regardless of whether they're playing fast or slow, or if they're on the ride like this, or they're on the hi-hat, their snare is still being hit in the same spot. They're playing similar volume all the time. If it's a blast beat or if it's a super slow beat. What happens a lot is drummers get like, they're playing the super hard thing and they're like, oh, and then here comes the easy part. Oh yeah, I can finally rock out, this is so fun. But it's sort of awful as a recording engineer because you have this great disparity of volume between two segments. So if you can sort of really work hard to play consistent on things that are maybe a little faster or more challenging for you, and if you can also work hard at sort of reeling in your enthusiasm when there's something easy to play. And the same thing happens too, like when, slow and easy, people tend to push the tempo, and like fast and hard, people tend to drag the tempo. So try to become aware of, if you're a drummer, try to become aware of your own natural tendencies and avoid that. And rehearsing, even if you don't record to a click track, rehearsing to a click track can really help point out your own natural inconsistencies, and that's true for any instrumentalist, but especially a drummer.
How much do you, some people are very directive of the drummer when they're tracking, like hit harder, hit softer. They'll keep tracking it over and over and over until they're hitting at the volume that you think is correct. How directive are you in that sort of situation?
I mean, if something's really off, I'll encourage people, but I'm not typically working with a band long enough that I can afford to spend the time to really do that. And I'm not in the business of changing people too much. I'm trying to capture and enhance what they're doing rather than change them. Like I always say that I'm making their record, they're not making my record. So I'm trying to do the best with what I have, but I will often try to plant the seed in a drummer's mind that like, hey, next time you come in here and record, here's some things that you could work on. without putting them on the spot and making them feel as though I feel like they're an inferior player or something like that. I just want to sort of give them words of encouragement or things that I think they can improve upon the next time.
So just be like, next time you could probably just stay home.
Yeah, I mean, I know you guys have done the stuff with Eyal, and he has certainly a much different approach on drummers, and I think that the bands that he records are, really concerned about
Perfection
in that really polished finished product, and that's the kind of aesthetic they're going after. For me and the bands that I typically record, I think they're more concerned about making something that's a reflection of who they are, or maybe an optimized version of what they are and who they are. But feeling like a group of people participating in something together, and making a record that's their record is usually their goal. So I'm not typically trying to replace band members, but sometimes I want to.